So, yeah, thanks a lot. And, I'm giving this talk and this topic because I am very interested in dehumanization, especially from a social psychological perspective. I've been immersing myself in the literature, and I have been starting some programs of research on the topic, but I will not be today presenting any of my own research data, mainly because some of the stuff we're doing, it's some high-risk studies, and you know what happens when you do high-risk studies. They don't always work out immediately the way you want to, so none of my own data are really necessarily ready for prime time. They might not even be ready for public access TV. They're just not ready to be presented. So, but nonetheless, I'm going to just tell you sort of what's going on in social psychology when it comes to this topic and how people have been thinking about it and studying it recently. But first, let me just make, I don't want to stand in front of that, I'll start with 2 points that are probably obvious. The first obvious point is that, as you know, dehumanization has been a long time a feature of group conflict, especially violent group conflict. And you don't have to look very far for evidence of that kind of thing. Just looking at, you can squeeze in there a bit.
Yeah. I'm trying to be subtle on doing that.
No, don't be subtle. Just push them aside. Okay. Anyway, you don't have to look far for that. And here are some examples of some wartime propaganda posters, as you can see, from World War I and World War II. And so the groups we are in conflict with are sometimes portrayed as wild beasts, predators that are threatening us, sometimes as animals that need to be hunted. And, unfortunately, if you want a great trove of such imagery, looking at Nazi propaganda is always, unfortunately, a good place to look. And here I've specifically selected images that indicate another aspect of dehumanization, portraying the other group as not necessarily wild beasts or prey, but as vermin. And I'll get back to that a little bit later. So sometimes when I give these talks and present these images, I don't have to say this to this group, but I try to emphasize that I'm not trying to say that this is something that people did in the past and we no longer do today. That's why I'm showing you these old images, obviously. As you know, you can still find dehumanization of outgroups, and just sticking with cockroaches, for example. I'm thinking of Raphael Eitan, who was an Israeli general and politician. 1983 said, when we have settled the land, all the Arabs will be able to do about it will be to scurry around like drug cockroaches in a bottle. And I also probably don't have to tell this group in the Rwandan genocide, the Tutsis were explicitly labeled as cockroaches that needed to be exterminated. And frankly, even just going to the Post-Standard, a number of years ago, I copied this cartoon, and it's kind of weird. I'm not even entirely sure I understand it. But let's see, radicalized thinking cannot be defeated with bombs. So go and spread our violent ideology. My death, my pretties. I mean, it seems like members of ISIS are being shown as being cockroaches. I'm getting that right. It's kind of weird. And by the way, I had an image of this, and it was kind of blurry, so I went online yesterday to get a new, fresher image, and I just assumed when I searched for this, I was going to find the image, and also all the people online saying how this was in terrible taste, and presenting human beings as cockroaches. Well, anyway, I couldn't find anything like that, so I don't know. Maybe I was the only one who was horrified by this image, but usually it's not hard to find people yelling about things online, about just about anything. So the fact that I really couldn't find anyone commenting on this struck me as kind of weird. Okay, now, I'll also get back to this idea that dehumanization is not just a question of animal metaphors. There's more to it than that. I'll get to that. But first, the second obvious thing I wanted to say is that dehumanization, of course, is not just a feature of propaganda campaigns, but dehumanization is something that everyday people do as well. Everyday people will dehumanize others, and maybe you don't need any evidence for that. Maybe you have seen evidence yourself that's probably perfectly valid. But you'd be interested to know somebody introduced a measure a few years ago that is now being used in a number of studies. It's a measure of blatant dehumanization. And of course, you'll recognize this sort of cliche ascent of man figure here, but this is literally a measure now that this person introduced and that people use. People can vary in how human-like they seem. Some people seem highly evolved, whereas others seem no different than lower animals. Using the image below indicate how evolved you consider the average member of each group to be. And so...
Is this real?
Yes. So I was about to say, if there was a student and for their master's they proposed using this, I would say, this is not going to work, okay? This is United States, 2020, everyone's just going to slide it all the way to the end, and that's going to be the end of it. But there actually is variance on that. People do. Yeah?
To your point, was this used as a social experience to better understand people's inaccurate perceptions, or was this science?
Yeah. Nothing had to do with accuracy. They sort of assumed that it's inaccurate by definition, if you don't. But the idea was just, well, I'll tell you why this was developed, this measure, okay? Because here's the thing. So until a few years ago, social psychologists were studying dehumanization, but it was sort of taken for granted that, look, if you want to study this now at this time and place, you got to be subtle. You can't just ask people directly. Do you think members of other groups are less than human? So for many years, the literature was really dominated by these more subtle measures, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, but if you go to PsychLit now and look and see what's been done on dehumanization, you'll find a lot of studies that use this method. They look at something called infrahumanization. What is infrahumanization? Well, you can read that there, but this is terrible, poor taste, but it's kind of like dehumanization light. The idea was that we're not going to be able to get people to say outright that other groups are less than human, so we'll use these other kinds of measures, and the way it's almost always done, infrahumanization is supposed to be more than this, but the way it's always done is by looking at the types of emotions people believe are typical of in-group and out-group members, especially members of dislike groups. And more specifically, the finding is often that when people rate their own in-groups and other groups of people, especially groups they're in conflict with, they say that, sure, people in those groups very often experience fear, sadness, surprise, attraction, pleasure, anger. These are like the primary emotions that we assume maybe even animals can experience. But then there are these secondary emotions like guilt, love, admiration, slightly more subtle emotions, indicative of a more richer inner life. And when it comes to that, often you find that people will say members of outgroups are less likely to experience these emotions, which is interesting, maybe in and of itself, but this was kind of, for a while, almost like the gold standard measure of dehumanization, because it was thought, it's subtle, it's indirect, but this is all we can do now, because people are just not going to tell us that, some member of another group is like down here. But it turns out that people will do that. Maybe it doesn't surprise you, maybe it does, but they do, and you don't have to use anything this exotic. Just actually preparing for the talk yesterday, I was reading a paper, Israelis and their impressions of Palestinians, and the author used a measure that was really just like a 1 to 11 scale, like how human do you think they are, where 1 means not human at all and 11 means very human. And I looked at the data in the paper, and it looked like the mean score was below the midpoint. And so I actually emailed the author, who I know, and said, I promise I'm not one of these people who's trying to catch you out for mistakes in your data. There's a lot of that going around. I said, did you really find it? And she assures me that, yeah, she did find it. It was below the midpoint. So apparently you don't have to get so subtle. So I don't know, that sort of answered your question. The reason it was developed, part was just to see, will people actually do this? And then it's been used in studies, as I'll mention, just to see, well, what does it predict once you dehumanize a group? What other thoughts and feelings does that relate to? All right. So these are obvious things. Now, maybe some less obvious things about dehumanization, which is that I think we all think we know what dehumanization means, and we probably could all come up with a reasonable definition, but what does it mean exactly? So if you're going to be a behavioral scientist and do research on it, you've got to have some kind of definition. What exactly do we mean by dehumanization? Are there different kinds of dehumanization? Obviously, it means more than just saying that members of other groups are different than us or worse than us. So just quickly, I just want to show you, if you look in the literature, here are some ways people are thinking about dehumanization. Let me get past this stuff here. So, for example, Haslam introduced a distinction, and I hate the way he phrased this distinction because I can never remember what one is supposed to refer to and what the other one is. It's denial of uniquely human attributes, denial of human nature. Sounds like the same thing to me. But so whenever I teach about this, I'm like, I can't remember which is which. But it more or less is like this, that it sort of boils down to the idea that, well, dehumanization sometimes means perceiving other groups as animal-like, but there are other kinds of dehumanization, like perceiving people like robots or inanimate objects. So they're less than us, they're not human, they're not animals, they're just, some other kind of being. And so, for example, comparing people to apes, vermin, jackals, obviously it'd be that kind of thing, but this sort of refers to the kind of dehumanization that might take place, for example, when doctors treat patients as things, when people view others as sexual objects, when you see members of a bureaucracy as being just robots or something like that. Let's see, where am I at? Okay. So that's an interesting distinction. So obviously this gets back to what I was saying before, where the most prominent examples of dehumanization we can think about, probably the ones that are most common in violent intergroup conflict, are the animal metaphors. But there may be some other dimensions of dehumanization. So people are trying to study when one kind takes place and when the other kind takes place, and what are the consequences of this kind of thing. Now,
Yeah, so, for example, when people talk about, let's say, murder, they're usually talking about denial of human nature, where you see a person as an object. So
right. Right.
It's this other.
Sure.
But you don't necessarily see that person as an animal.
No. Right. Yes. And if I could get a good sample of contract killers to do a study with, I would have to assume that they would say this is the kind of dehumanization
I don't know this, but I would suspect in a lot of cases of murder, people are able to do that because they don't see that person as quite having the kind of feelings and other things that they have.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. And maybe in some contexts it wouldn't matter what kind of dehumanization you're doing. It's still, they're less than human.
Right, and murder is still murder.
Right, murder is still murder. And this doesn't really inform much of my own research, but I just wanted to show you this is one distinction people make. I'm kind of interested, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just the example that comes to me from my own divorce case in terms of being represented by someone who didn't really do a lot of homework on me, but that your voice as a non-professional is not respected at court usually. So there's the question of really clipping your voice. In other words, you could label somebody, but if you don't let them express very much, you're not going to have a very full view of them.
Right. Oh, sure. Yeah. And that gets back to, that's way ahead. When people talk about how can we undermine dehumanization, often it does involve some form of having people interact and having them hear each other's voices.
This distinction also implies that sometimes dehumanization isn't necessarily a bad thing, because for a doctor or professional, for example, if a doctor gets emotionally involved in every patient, at some point the doctor's going to need your help or somebody else's.
Okay. Yeah. Yes. I understand. Exactly.
So there are times that maybe it actually
that maybe it is functional in that section. Right. If you're doing an operation, if you're thinking my God, I hope this doesn't hurt the person. And that might not be the best frame of mind to be in. Sure. Okay. Yeah. Actually, I'll talk about another example, something somewhat related to that. So I'm actually interested in the fact that, well, okay, I get it. You can treat people as animals and see them as animals, but I think, isn't it different to see somebody as a bloodthirsty predator versus seeing them as a cockroach? I don't know. It seems like different animals to me. It seems like something else is going on there. So there's a guy named David Livingston Smith who has written about this, and this idea that, yeah, if you look at the way groups have been animalized, I guess, in conflict, you can more or less divide it up into three categories: vermins, parasites, wild, dangerous animals, and what he says, innocuous game that can be hunted for sport, like prey. So portraying someone as like a gazelle, I guess, is a little different than a cockroach or a bloodthirsty wolf. And anyway, he's like an evolutionary psychologist, so I kind of love the way he writes about this. He tries to, evolutionary psychologists try to make the case that if we have these categories, it must have something to do with how our species interacted with animals over the eons, and you don't necessarily have to buy this, but, he proposes that...
Or which animals we admire, because sports teams, for example, don't have cockroaches.
You're getting ahead of me.
No.
You're getting ahead of me. Okay, you're right. So, right. So he says, look, maybe, in the past, our ancestors always had to deal with the risks of parasite infection. So if you're an evolutionary psychologist, think we developed some kind of mental module to deal with that. You don't have to think in those terms, I promise. But dehumanized people are often seen as dangerous, unclean animals, creatures like rats, worms, lice, maggots. At the same time, predators have haunted the human imagination since prehistoric times. So as a result, we always had to deal with animals that were trying to kill us, large, dangerous animals. Okay, so maybe that's why we have that category. And then finally, there's an ancient legacy of hunting, an ingrained cognitive system specialized in identification and capture of prey. Maybe, again, you don't have to buy this evolutionary psych talk. So, yes, that's another one. But yes, if you think in those terms, actually, so that's interesting. You could say, well, okay, throughout human history, they were prey, they were predators, they were vermin, but they were like companion animals and things like that. Or
animals, like bulldogs or whatever it is that people make the analogy, or even getting close to Chinese New Year's, your sign.
Right.
You actually embrace that.
Right. And I did once run a preliminary study in which I had people read descriptions of athletic teams that were called things like either the bears or the other thing. Well, because they're animals we admire. If you call
Except
someone,
if you're the orange.
Okay. Right. Yes. But you can call someone wise as an owl or something like that, right? That's not a terrible thing to say. Is that dehumanization? Or brave as a lion or something. So yes, there's a million directions we can go with this, but some of these definitions at least raise the possibility that, it is probably good to carefully define what dehumanization is, because, maybe in some cases it's like not even a negative thing, and maybe,
But the fact that we do that almost because we're willing to be bulldogs or whatever, that almost seems to me to make us willing to make that analogy. Easier to make that animal analogy to cockroaches. Okay, you're a bulldog, you're a cockroach, and make those kinds of distinctions.
Yeah, well, I assume if you say I'm a member of the Tigers and I want to go out there and act like a tiger, you're saying in this context, I'm going to suppress those other human attributes and.
If I admire you and you're the tiger, but don't admire him and he's the, I can start creating labels. It almost gives me the license to create labels.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, so, So, anyway, you can think now in terms of specific animal metaphors. And I really don't want to say And I just again want to give you this idea that once people started studying this, they said, well, what do we mean by dehumanization? Aren't there different ways of dehumanizing people? Maybe we got to think about this systematically. And I really don't like this system here. Please just, but just to show you all the things people come up with, someone else said, look, in the end, human beings, we have agency, and there are three kinds of agency. We have the ability to experience emotions and possess desires. We have the ability to produce a behavior and exhibit activity, to plan our behavior and act intentionally. We have the ability to hold beliefs and think rationally, right? This is all what it means to be human. So maybe sometimes you dehumanize people in this way or that way or another way or in some combination of ways. And if you do the math, then you'll end up with 7 kinds of dehumanization that maybe we can study. And I don't think anyone's ever gone to try to see what are the different effects of the different kind of dehumanization. It's 2 by 2 by 2 minus 1, because of course, if you have all those things, then you're not being dehumanized. So, just another way to look at it. So again, there are a number of, it's not so obvious what is the best way to define dehumanization, or maybe there are multiple kinds depending on what you're interested in. All right, the second not so obvious thing I want to say, which is this. If you're a behavioral scientist and you insist on the kind of evidence that meets the criteria that behavioral scientists really insist on and live for, it's not actually clear, or at least some people would argue, that we might not have airtight evidence that dehumanization actually directly plays a causal role in how we treat each other. So, for example, in this review a number of years ago, there's Haslam again, they did a review and looked to see all the things that dehumanization had been related to or associated with in the literature in the last few years. And they came up with things like dehumanization is related to support of the use of torture, support for deportation or forced migration. The more you dehumanize people, the more you support that, recommending harsh punishment, accepting unjust treatment, all this stuff. So there's a lot of evidence like this, but as they point out, rarely are these associations shown to be causal. Now, so what does that mean? They do point out that, well, it seems plausible that dehumanization would cause these things, but, again, just playing by the rules that I have to play by, just showing 2 things are correlated doesn't necessarily tell you which thing is causing the other thing. So what I am saying is that some of these studies leave open the possibility that, if you, for example, support torture, maybe you experience a little dissonance and you have to justify supporting torture, so the dehumanization is almost a rationalization of the negative behavior or the negative thing rather than a cause of it, right? So, I accept unjust treatment of a group, but you're not supposed to accept unjust treatment of people. Most people don't think that's right, so you'd have to, they're less than human, that's why they deserve the unjust treatment. So as they point out, really the association is causal, though this interpretation is generally plausible, and I entirely agree with them, and it's not hard to imagine that dehumanization would have these outcomes, but it is interesting, if you look in the psychological literature, that, people will point out we don't have airtight evidence for causality. Yes?
I was trying to formulate my question based on, if you look at, treatment at the U.S.-Mexico border, what would be the other suggestion? You support nationalism, or you support, and therefore you're justifying by dehumanizing? Or, I guess I have a hard time not understanding the direct correlation.
How the direct correlation could be, right.
Yeah, and I wonder,
right.
is there another level of study that can...
Well, yeah. No, what someone would say is, someone might say, we don't want people in our country, it's bad for our country, we have to do whatever we can to stop them from doing it, and that's going to require drastic measures, but putting them in cages, that's bad, but, it doesn't matter. These people aren't human anyway.
So that's dehumanization, though.
Right.
That would be the...
Well, so that would be dehumanization, sort of almost as a rationalization or a way of making yourself feel better about the terrible treatment rather than being the cause of it.
Okay, I guess my thought is that if we had a bunch of, I guess, all of us in this room
Yeah.
wanted into the country, and then we have
Yeah.
the people that are actually trying
Right.
to find safety and
Right.
my assumption,
Yes.
and perhaps inaccurate, would be that people that currently are in support of
Yeah.
MPP or keeping people in
Right.
Mexico would allow the group that look like this room predominantly
Right.
to come in, but
Yes.
the other group. And so to me that is
I'm sure that
clear.
assumption is accurate.
Well, so that to me is pretty.
Right.
One is less than the other.
Right. Right. Yes. Yeah, and I agree. And remember, I haven't said here that the literature shockingly shows us that dehumanization never causes anything. Not at all. Again, as they said, they kind of just said, look, it's plausible. We assume that
It's a definite
it has a
thing.
causal role. But
Yeah.
but they're saying, but it could work both ways. Is what I'm saying. It could sometimes be a
Yeah.
cause and sometimes be a rationalization.
Well, that's, I mean, I can see the correlation. I can't always see the causal. For example,
Right.
take your example of torture.
Yeah.
From a rational point of view, torture won't work if you think that person is less than human in the first place.
Yeah. Okay.
You may,
Well-
you may justify it after
Right.
the fact. The same thing with
Right.
deportation or immigration. You may not want the people in because you don't think they're human.
Right.
On the other hand, it may just be you protecting yourself, and then you justify your actions because you're
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So it could either thing be going on, and actually, yeah, something you just said, to torture people, you have to assume they're human. Let's get back to that because
Well,
it relates to one other point. No, I understand what you're saying. Yeah.
I'm responding because the scale kind of laid me into the group in the room, and in terms of maybe that's why the group is this way. And my response, right now anyway, is she's saying that there aren't many Asians or yellow people or black people. And my response is the trade routes, the important traders are European-based for this population.
Right.
And,
Okay.
and the amount of trade between America and Britain and America and the Mediterranean
Yeah.
was very big
Right.
for like 4 centuries probably.
Right. Okay.
I
Yeah.
don't think that's
Yeah. Well, all I can say for that is that, much as social psychologists try to boil this down into basic psychological principles, there's a historical context for all of
The
this,
Pacific is so much
but probably
wider
that
than the
issue
Atlantic,
is
too.
outside the scope of what we can address
Yeah.
with this literature. So I just wanted to again to show you. So I'm always embarrassed to show you this study because see the kind of dopey things social psychologists do. But the answer to, well, what about causality is like, well, we know how we establish causality. We do experiments. Remember, experiments. Manipulate a variable, look at the cause. So let's do dehumanization experiments. And
I can see that getting through
well,
the.
okay, yeah. Well, this, as you can see, I'm putting up this study here just because it is actually still cited quite a bit, much to my amazement. Right, maybe you couldn't get away with doing this with the current IRB, as you'll see. So, anyway, this look, so if you wanted to do an experiment to see does dehumanization cause something, maybe you would do something like this. Electric shocks, kind of like the Milgram study. Okay, so participants were presented with the task of administering shocks. So there's going to be these other people there, and they're going to do a task, and you're going to have to punish them for their mistakes by deciding how many electric shocks to give people. Yeah, the IRB isn't going for this anymore, are they? But this was back then. Participants never met members of the group. The people are going to be shocked. They're just arrived. They're in the other room now, and they'll communicate via this screen. Again, it's well-controlled experiment. So, this seems very artificial, but they then arranged for people to accidentally hear the comments of one of the other experimenters. The mic was left on, and the guy said something like, "Oh, they look like a dehumanized, animalistic bunch." So they were just literally labeled as, it's like, dehumanized bunch, okay? And in the other condition, they were not labeled as a dehumanized, animalistic bunch. And guess what? In that condition, there was a higher level of shocking. So, to this day, the study gets cited, and in part, not because people are too dumb to see the limitations of the study, but just because there aren't a lot of experiments that try to do something like this. They tried to do something like this. they had an effect there. But as I constantly point out to my students, if I said, hey, I just did an experiment, and one group was described in a negative way, and that group got worse treatment, isn't that amazing? They would say, yeah, not really. What else could have possibly happened in that experiment? And so, what if you had described them as bad people or jerks or just yucky, whatever bad word you want. I mean, anything, you might have gotten the same results. So clearly, this doesn't provide us with unique special evidence for the effect of dehumanization, but it does show how it's not as easy as it looks maybe to run a study. And, you could think of, I don't know, you'd have other conditions, dehumanized condition, the bad condition, but I don't know,
Is this an update of the famous, like California, Summerby?
No, you're thinking of the Milgram study, but yes, the idea that you'll be shocking people in another room does have echoes of the Milgram study.
No,
except,
this guy with the name with the...
Yeah, no, you're thinking of Zimbardo, but there were no electric shocks in the Stanford prison experiment.
Oh, is that right?
They were just people actually beating on each other, but no electric shocks in that particular one. So, so it has echoes of that.
Social psychologists have all the fun.
We have, we're not allowed to have that much fun anymore. It's just unfortunate. Okay, so it's hard to imagine the perfect experiment that you would do. So I don't know. There are other studies that have been done. They kind of all have the same limitation. So, I know. Right, it's kind of weird for me to say. I mean, it's obvious dehumanization will affect people and how they treat other people. So it is kind of surprising, if you look at the empirical literature, that it's been kind of a difficult thing to establish to the satisfaction of the kind of people who review social psychology studies. Okay, actually just about, the third, I said two obvious things. Dehumanization has taken place for a long time. People do it. Less obvious, it's hard to define. It's hard to show it having a causal role on behavior. But the last thing I want to say is, so that guy, David Livingston Smith, I mentioned before, he wrote at one point, nowadays it is widely accepted that we tend to picture our enemies as less than human. So widely accepted, in fact, that it has become a cliche. Now, whether or not you agree that it's become a cliche, it certainly seems that at least when it comes to extreme conflict and the really terrible things that people do to each other, it's not hard to find people saying things like that dehumanization is not just an important element of victimizing other people, but it's basically like a necessary factor. So Kelman, who said the inhibitions against murdering fellow human beings are generally so strong, victims must be deprived of their human status if systematic killing is to proceed in a smooth and orderly fashion. And Bandura said it's difficult to mistreat humanized persons without risking self-condemnation. So you condemn yourself if you do that. So you've got to dehumanize them. Someone else who wrote a book on hate said no mass atrocities in the world have occurred without some form of dehumanization. And as a philosopher named Lang said, the underlying assumption seems to be that a lack of empathy, the absence of a sense you're violating moral code requires that the perpetrator sever any ties of identification with the victim as a human being. So sometimes you'll read people say things that sound like not only is dehumanization a big element in the terrible things people do to each other in mass killing, but that it's a necessary element. So, much as I understand the importance of dehumanization, here I want to read you something, not from a psychology journal, but from that academic journal, The New Yorker. It's an article, it was from Adam Gopnik, who sometimes annoys me, but this was an interesting article, and he was writing about the terror after the revolution in France. And he says, the terror was sadistic, it was cruel. Its victims, robbed even of minimal dignity, were forced to travel to their deaths in open carts, laid on planks, decapitated, as the crowd cheered and the blood sprayed and the heads were held up, frozen in a grimace. Whole families were killed, one by one, and forced to watch as each went to the scaffold. And he says, it is often said that terror of this kind is possible only when one has first dehumanized some group of people. Aristocrats in this case, or Jews, or the bourgeoisie. In fact, what motivated the spectacle was exactly the knowledge that the victims were people, and capable of feeling pain and fear as people do. We don't humiliate vermin. We don't put them through show trials. We don't make them watch their fellow vermin die first. Now, this is not an academic article or an academic study, but, he's not the only one. Getting back to that guy Lang, he said, in looking at the Holocaust, he said attributing a host of negative characteristics to the Jews essentialized them by subordinating their individual complexities, but it did not in any obvious way reduce them to the non-human. Or one could argue that mistreating people does not always lead to self-condemnation. And because it doesn't, dehumanization is not a necessary step on the path to mass murder. So, and this is not Lang anymore, this is just me, I think just one thing that I have concluded looking at this is that, yes, sometimes we find it easier to kill other people or do terrible things to them because we've dehumanized them. But sometimes people are okay with doing that because these are just really, really bad people. They're not animals. They're not... and I realize at a certain point you could say it's just a question of semantics. Maybe if you think someone is so bad that they cease to be human, but again, if dehumanization has any meaning, it's not obvious that this is always the case. So it is true that people will probably find it easier to brutalize other people when they've convinced themselves that those others are not human, but it's also probably true that we can brutalize them when we think they're really bad people. So dehumanization is an important element of violent conflict, I believe, but we shouldn't even overstate its importance or its role in some of the terrible things that people do. Yeah?
When you talk about trying to make a connection between dehumanization and
Yes.
behavior, it appeared to me that looking at not necessarily experiments, but actual political speech and what happens after we're kind of in a community potentially.
Right.
Could be a way of establishing that relationship. And people
Right.
have said that
Yeah.
since Trump got elected, there are more incidents of hate
Right.
speech and incidents of discrimination, etc., etc.
Right. Yeah.
And I was going to ask you, because I just was hearing this yesterday, somebody referred to President Trump as a Teletubby, so...
A Teletubby? Oh,
I
okay.
haven't heard that in a long time.
And the question is, I don't know, is this one person who's really, really bad that there is a Teletubby?
Right.
It's a
Yeah.
dehumanization.
Yeah, no, so I agree. I mean, there's tons of archival evidence on this kind of thing where the dehumanization language preceded something else. So, yeah, sure. I'm, again, putting on my, methodological purist hat, I would then have to say that, well, that evidence is suggestive, but there could be third variables that are causing both things to happen, and, you can't. But, right. Yeah, I think, yeah.
I've heard said, it's true, that human beings are basically pack animals. So if that's true, maybe whether it's dehumanization or saying they're bad people or some other thing, it's some way of identifying these people are not part of my pack. They're other.
They're other,
And that
right.
other justifies multiple behaviors, whether it's Jews that stand off on their own and are not part of our group, or some other people who somehow or another get identified as other, whether because they're animals, they're bad people, or whatever. They're not one of me.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I mean, is that part of it?
Yeah. Well, that's interesting you raise it, because one of the things I struggle with, and again, I'm sorry I got into this, is when you think about sort of that way, that, okay, dehumanization is one thing, but there's a long history of research in the social sciences on in-group, out-group effects, right? We perceive out-groups differently, right? And so, for example, there's something called the out-group homogeneity effect, where you see members of other groups as being more similar to each other than members of your own group. Then there's just plenty of in-group favoritism studies showing that, you see members of other groups as maybe less moral than your own group. So, but, so at a certain point, if you say, okay, if our definition of human is what my group is like, and if other groups are different, then it's like almost now the entire literature on in-group, out-group effects is literature on dehumanization, because if they're different, that means they're not as human as my group. So this is one of the things I struggle with also, is trying to find what is unique about dehumanization that is not just an extreme manifestation of in-group, out-group dynamics that we see.
Well, but even in group dynamics, one thing I've noticed is if you're in a room and there's like one person that's different, whether it's all males and one female, that female will be forced to act different and actually stand by the group, almost not feel part of the group, and that in-group otherness seems to be emphasized.
Sure, yeah. So I mean, this is all tied up in all those basic in-group, out-group phenomena. So I just wanted to say, just following up on this just for a second, again, this is, just to illustrate what I'm talking about here. And again, I realize at some point it comes down to semantics and how you're going to define dehumanization. But a lot of people have pointed out that, let's look at a lot of the genocides in the last 100 years or so. So let's see. We had the Jews in Europe, and they were a minority group, but they were a particular kind of minority group that was seen as actually kind of more educated and wealthy, and even though they're different from us, they're certainly not stupid. They might actually have the power to infiltrate our institutions and mess up our society. Let's see, then you have, the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire, and they were a minority, but they were seen as kind of like an educated, fairly wealthy minority group that actually might, behind the scenes, really have the power to be collaborating with Russia. Then you've got the Tutsis in Rwanda, who were seen as a more educated elite group in that society. Should I go on? You've got the Chinese people in Indonesia in the 1960s, massacred there as well. So often, groups that are very much a target of genocide are groups that are minority groups that are seen as different from the main group, but that are not necessarily seen as like stupid or subhuman. They're mistrusted and hated precisely because people can get themselves to believe that they not only wish us ill, they could actually do something about it. They, the international Jewish conspiracies taking place behind the scenes, they could do it, You know what I mean? So often the groups that are targeted for genocide it's not immediately dehumanization. It's that they're really bad humans. Speaking of archival studies, I don't know. I've often thought about doing the study, like most of my studies, probably won't work. But at the beginning of the talk, I showed you some Nazi imagery of Jews as vermin, right? So Jews are rats, Jews are cockroaches, Jews are maggots. Maggots are really good at controlling the international banking system, and they're really good at. No, it doesn't make any sense. I've sort of been interested, if you look at the propaganda, would you find earlier on the propaganda was more focused on they're bad people and they should be killed. But once it came time to kill them, then you had to switch to the vermin maggot imagery because that makes it easier to kill them. I don't know if that's true.
Or maybe...
Yes, I'm sorry, yes.
Maybe the emphasis could be on who uses this language. Not, take them for whatever, and then look at how come some people use it under what circumstances. Mm-hmm. It's harder to know what the effect is.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of other things going on.
I know, right.
But the use of the language itself.
Yeah.
For mobilization, for...
Yeah. I get it, yeah.
Justification, all kinds of reasons.
Right.
But as you point out, some of them are quite irrational and on the face of it.
Yeah.
But that's another kind of issue.
Yeah, no, well, just fine. Yeah, so people do that also and look at how they use it. But so recently, okay, I'll tell you about a study I did. It's driving me crazy. Because I encountered a paper like that where someone, did a content analysis of the media, the news, and how Islamic people were portrayed after 9/11 and focused on the language used in the media and how even if there wasn't always explicit dehumanization, there was this subtle use of language that you would use for talking about animals, so that we're hunting them, they're infesting an area, they're in a nest, these kinds of animal-like sort of words that seem to be in evidence. So again, being an experimentalist, I said, I got to do an experiment to see if this works. So I did a study, and I almost did do a study because I thought the study's so obviously going to work, no one will find it interesting. Won't be able to get it published because everyone's going to say, well, of course, we expect you to find. So I did a study where people read this fictional uprising in another country and had to imagine there were a person there, and they were looking for their group, and they were in their headquarters, and they were spreading out over the area. Well, that was one condition. And in the other condition, they read the same description, except it was full of, like, they were in their nest. They were caught in their breeding grounds, they're infesting the area, we're hunting them. I just really laid on every word like that I could find in there without directly calling them animals. And I said, as a result, they're going to see this group as less than human, perceive them as more negatively. It didn't work. I don't know why. All right? Sometimes experiments don't work. I don't know what to tell you about. Maybe the manipulation wasn't strong enough. I don't know. I got to try something like that again. But I agree, if you want to understand dehumanization and, looking at how it plays out in the real world and how people use the language is, that's your primary data. But if you want to play the experimental social psychology game, you got to do that kind of thing to show that it's not just speculation. All right. So I'm sorry. Boy, this is terrible. But, I did almost promise in my talk then, what does this have to say about conflict resolution? Why did I promise to say something about that? I wanted to challenge myself, because social psychologists are much better at pointing out all the ways in which people are bad and say bad things about each other than coming up with good solutions for anything like that. In fact, I was thinking, okay, basically then, I should really know, what have social psychologists done about rehumanization? We've got dehumanization. How about rehumanization? So I went to PsycInfo, the database of all studies ever published in psychology, and I put in rehumanization, and boy, I got maybe 20 or less hits, and a lot of those were it was words used in passing. There was almost nothing there on rehumanization in the literature. When that happens to me, sometimes I try to put into context for me just how surprising it would be not to find something in the literature. So just forgive me for this. I also searched PsycLit for cheeseburgers, earwax, and the tooth fairy, and I found almost as many hits for those things in the psych literature as I did for rehumanization. Just sometimes I try to put into context for myself that, considering that you can find almost anything in a big literature, when there's something you think is important and you can't find it, it's really kind of striking. Yeah.
Well, and this word reconciliation comes to mind.
Reconciliation, yes.
Because what it is assuming there was an antagonism which is overcome.
Mm-hmm.
And
right.
and there's
Sure.
a vast literature.
I understand that. Yes, there's a vast literature. I was trying to look to see, is there any evidence specifically that dehumanization, however it was defined, can be a direct target in efforts at reconciliation. Is there something unique about this situation?
Contact theory.
Is there something? What's that?
Contact theory. I mean, that's the claim.
Right. Though, of course, contact theory is complicated, and there are all sorts of ways to
That's right.
be in contact with people, and there's a right way and there's a wrong way. Yeah.
You mentioned the Tutsi Hutu genocide in Rwanda, and I remember listening a story about how the country tried to use a soap opera
Yeah.
to try to get people
Right.
to kind of talk
Yeah.
better about each
Right.
other, and as a way of kind of
Sure.
rehumanizing
Right.
Tutsis.
Yeah, that was a guy, Irv Stab, who was, at the University of Massachusetts. He spearheaded that, and that was one of the interventions they did. And part of that, I assume, was rehumanization. But I don't know if they measured that specifically. Yeah, I'm sorry. Let me just.
Using the example of genocide specifically, genocide dehumanizes and does the violence to rearrange the cosmos, so a certain group of people don't have space to exist, even if they still exist. And dehumanizing is a process done within the genocide, but even after the killing stops, there's still maybe not dehumanization exactly, but forms of persecution, prejudice, denials, and especially with the genocide community, I'm talking specifically about Circassians. There's no longer a Circassian homeland. So, there's, without that, and they, in diaspora, they exist within and outside of social structures that are not their own. So in terms of rehumanizing, how does one go about the rehumanization process when does it come from the perpetrators? Because in a way that's not always transformative. How does it come from within when it's been 150 years of genocide and post-genocidal practices, experiences?
Right.
Or within the social structures that you now find a home in, where is that? Because you are still an outsider to an extent. You are still othered, maybe not seen as an animal, but in some cases, yes, So where does rehumanization come? Within that specific locality.
Yeah. Wait, and are you also referring to this idea of internalizing the dehumanization of the group itself?
I would not say internalizing, but where does rehumanization come from? I think rehumanization can come from within the group that's been targeted without them necessarily internalizing the dehumanization. But it's almost like reclaiming the narrative, not being seen so much as a consequence of the conflict, but part of the resolution at the same time.
Yeah. Well, that's very interesting. I know, and I'll just say that, what I was trying to look for as a psychologist is to say, okay, do we know anything about psychological interventions that could play a role in reconciliation that undermine dehumanization? But this is actually a problem I sometimes have with my own field where, psychologists, we document prejudice, we document stereotyping, we document stigmatization. No, and then sometimes people say, all right, what can we do about it? But because we're psychologists, then obviously it seems like, well, the most effective thing to do is some kind of psychological intervention. That might not be the case, right? That might not be the best bang for your buck. Sometimes these structural changes have effects and this is why, a major area of research in psychology on stereotyping and prejudice is how effectively people can suppress thoughts of stereotypes. If I might stereotype you, can I get myself to not do it? Can I suppress that thought? Can I do it? And in fact, I'm sorry, you mentioned this book I edited years ago on the social psychology of the Holocaust. Yeah, I recruited a lot of people to write things for that book. And afterwards people said, how come you didn't have any stereotyping or prejudice researchers in the book? That seems like the most obvious group. And I said, I asked a lot of them, and they said, I don't see how my work relates to the issue of genocide. I said, what? But it's not surprising because at the time, one of the big issues was, can people suppress thoughts about stereotypes? And it's that's not a big issue during genocide. I understand that. So,
The crazy thing, what you brought up, though, which is kind of an interesting issue, is most of the intervention is focused on the majority. If you're the victim of being a stereotype, to some degree, even if the majority stops theoretically that behavior, it's still internalized in the minority. So how does the minority reconcile and not keep on stepping away? And the more that the person who's the victim steps away, the more other they continue to be. And keeping that. And it's very hard, but how do you tell a victim, go talk to your enemy? It's or almost imply, well, it's your fault for not reaching out. You can't do that. But on the other hand, that all our attention seems to be focused on the majority, and yet there is an issue with the person who has been the victim. And it seems even crueler to say, well, you need to take additional action, which would be very hard to say. But yet on the other hand, there may be some reality.
There might be. Yeah,
In
right.
the Gospels, the model that you said of the aggrieved person going, well, you say the enemy, but I'm going to say a little less, the aggrieved person. I read this like 7-8 months ago. The aggrieved person is supposed to go to the person that caused it and face them, confront them with the problem. And that's pretty much like the court system operates, which is, if you have a complaint, you're the plaintiff of the complaint, and the court will summon someone to respond to the complaint.
But how do you do that with big groups? It's even harder.
Yeah, I know, scaling some of these things up, especially. So, yeah, let me just show you very briefly the last little thing. This won't take. So, again, I'm looking, and there are many different definitions of dehumanization, but one thing they have in common, right, is just this idea that people, when we dehumanize, we're saying they have very different internal lives than us, right?
Yeah.
They don't feel the same way we do. They don't react to situations the same way we do. They don't suffer like we do. They don't have the same affective world as we do, right? So a number of people who have thought about this have talked about, maybe the thing to do is to somehow get people to appreciate that members of this other group actually do have the same complicated human internal life that you do. So one of the few fairly useful references I found when I did my psych info search was this chapter by authors who maybe you're familiar with. And they said, look, resonating with another person emotionally will break the spell of dehumanization. Now, just saying that by itself, you might say, maybe that's not saying much. It's saying, get people to empathize with each other. That's what we need. And in fact, they do use the term empathy a lot when they talk about it. So, all right. So just saying, get people to empathize might not be terribly informative. And of course, there's the problem of how do you get that to happen? You don't just say, empathize with him and make that happen. So there is one study I found. Again, this is really not an earth-shattering study, but let's see. Yeah, you know that guy. Okay, yeah, so one of his collaborations, intergroup emotional similarity reduces dehumanization and promotes conciliatory attitudes in prolonged conflict. So this was a study done in the Middle East with Israelis and Palestinians, and they didn't just tell them, hey, these people have feelings just like you, or try to empathize with them. They literally set up a situation where they presented people with descriptions of certain events and, either told them or showed them concretely that these other people are reacting emotionally the same way that you are. Okay, so they literally got direct evidence, like you were upset by that, they were just as upset. You were angered by that, they were just as angry by that. And that experience seemed to reduce dehumanization, which in turn seemed to lead to more conciliatory attitudes. So, again, I know I didn't come up the hill to tell you the answer to all this is get people to empathize with each other. I don't think that would be an earth-shattering conclusion, but I just found this interesting because it maybe suggested something that, I don't know, maybe it's not so obvious, that there might be ways to make that happen, but you literally have to make it happen, set up a situation where people literally have concrete evidence in the moment that these others are responding the same way. Now, how you scale that up or how you apply that to an actual negotiation situation, I don't know, but that's something. Yeah.
I know we're out of time, but in addition to that, ostensibly that's what our media canon should be doing at a larger scale. I'm down at Newhouse, and that's largely the vein that I work in, trying to tell stories in a way showing people like ideally
who are in a situation, and you can see like I'd be in that situation.
Still with the objectivity, it's just like where we're choosing to focus and how we're the combination of pictures and words to try to bridge this widening gap.
Right. Huh.
So
wow, interesting.
More than one way, I would say.
Interesting. You're saying that's what you're working on?
That's a lot of my work,
yeah. Like to hear more of that? Yes,
Is this like a Q&A session? Or?
I guess so. I
You're saying the room,
I heard
so I
someone
wasn't
say
really-
we're out of time, so I thought, all right,
Oh, okay.
you're just going to kick me out now. But yeah, no.
I do have a question if you have
Yes.
more minutes. So I was thinking about, you mentioned it briefly, the kind of ways that we might, I guess it's a crossover between like in-group, out-group, and dehumanization, and I'm talking about when we kind of
Yeah.
boil a group of people down to one attribute. So specifically when people are talking about Mexicans as rapists or
Right.
Muslims as
Right.
terrorists, that's,
Right.
we're going in and we're saying this group of people are being characterized as this one,
Right.
often horrible,
Right. Yeah.
attribute, trait, just
It doesn't
slur.
matter. Characteristic.
And yeah, and I was wondering
Disposition. Well,
how,
yeah.
I was wondering how that would kind of, is that a part of dehumanization literature, or does it, and kind of does it seem in
Yeah.
research to have similar results?
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. I mean, these are fuzzy categories, like all these things. So right, there is literature on just how, yes, when we perceive outgroups, we see them as being a lot simpler than members of our own group, because that's variability between them. And then we see literature saying that, right, we sometimes attribute negative characteristics to outgroups, right? So if you put those together and say people in that group are all kind of similar, and they're similar in a bad way, right, it starts. Is that dehumanization? Is that what you're asking me?
Yeah,
I don't know. And it depends on your definition.
I would probably
And that's
define it that
right.
way, but-
And that's part of one of the things I'm struggling with, and I spend a lot of time thinking about, which is that, is there something unique about dehumanization, or is it just an extreme manifestation of those kinds of things that you're talking about? If I knew that, and I have a great answer to that question, I'd be off writing my psych review article right now.
Professor, I know that you have class at 2 o'clock, so you have to make it down the hill.
Another one at 3:30. What a day. Okay.
Just a short little plug. Next week, same time, same place, we have Professor Jeb Beagles, who actually is a research professor up in PARCC, and he will be presenting on what are the values of humanitarian INGOs, and if those values are reflected in their governance structures. Thank you all for coming out today, and thank you again, Professor.
Thank you.